Hi, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of how I run a flipped classroom. So based on sort of the very basic definitions that you've gotten in the other videos, I want to give you some more specific details. Now, it's important to start off with a definition of what I consider to be instruction. So I consider there to be two phases of instruction. The first phase is what we call content attainment. So this is where you're exposing them to the basic concept or basic content. So this is terms, definition, the structure, how things relate. And this looks very different in different disciplines, but it's just basic content. And then the second phase is concept application. So notice the difference in the terms. So the content is just giving them the pieces, and then we take it and we apply it to the real world, or we apply it to a different situation, and that helps the students build a conceptual framework of what this actually is. How do I use this information? What does this information actually mean? And so traditionally, so there on the left, traditionally we do this in where they come to class for content attainment, and you might give a lecture. Hopefully it's a beautiful interactive lecture where you introduce them to all the ideas. And then you send them home with a homework assignment where they're going to apply it and solve problems, right? Sometimes people skip that second step, and it's like the most important step because students tend to be situationally limited, right? So they learn the material and it becomes only applicable to that particular situation. So it's important that you give them this opportunity to turn content into concepts. So that's a traditional class. So the flipped classroom, I'm simply shifting that up. So they're getting the content attainment before they come to class. And then class time is used for this really important concept application. And I think this is really brilliant because the point at which students are trying to understand how this content is actually used and they're forming these conceptual frameworks is really critical to have you there to answer questions and to help them through this process. So flipped classroom gives you that benefit there. So I want to show you how these both can be constructivist though. It doesn't have to be a boring old video lecture, right? It doesn't have to be just dumping content on them. They can do both of these stages in a more active and constructivist, building their own understanding type framework. So I'm going to give you an example from my class, right? So I teach a lesson on biotechnology. I use Jack the Ripper. You can see my learning outcomes here. I want them to be able to explain the differences in our DNA, to understand DNA replication, to contrast historical hypotheses about it, to analyze STR outputs, determine differences, calculate STR probabilities, etc. So let's start with the pre-class activities. So this is what they do at home on their own before they come to class. And I do it through my learning management system. I happen to use Canvas. I just create these quizzes, which are kind of like what you're doing right now. And they walk through them before they come to class. Okay, so first thing I do, I present them with some kind of case study. So in the case of this lesson, it's Jack the Ripper, right? And we're giving them this idea that, when Jack the Ripper was alive and committing these atrocious crimes, there was no forensic science to speak of. And so they couldn't solve the mystery. But today, with what we know now about DNA and all of that, could we solve this mystery? So the students are kind of hooked and they're thinking, okay, can we solve this? And they're doing this on their own. I know these are really small. I don't expect you to read these. I'm just showing you what it looks like in Canvas. They're not just reading information, right? They are reading some information, but more I'm having them interact with the information. So I'm asking them, what kind of evidence might you gather? If you had all the money in the world and no ethical barriers, what kind of information could you gather about the Jack the Ripper cases? Could we exhume bodies? Could we look for DNA from descendants? Right? And so they're answering these questions, but you'll see like in question 4 here, there's all kinds of explanation that I also put in. I'm introducing them to short tandem repeats in the DNA. I'm giving them definitions. They are reading, but every few questions they pause and have to answer something. We have them go through experiments, classic experiments. This is the Michelson and Stahl experiment. So they're actually making predictions, using scientific reasoning skills as they're trying to construct this understanding of what we're talking about. I also embed tutorials. So I can do a little bit of a video lecture. I'm using a really cool program here called Explain Everything. I'll show you later on when we get together. But I have them walk through the material. I walk through it with them. So they do all of this before, and it's important to point out that I have the TAs just spot check that there are answers there. I don't care whether they're right or wrong, because this is the first time they're being exposed to this content, but this is that accountability. So students know they're going to get a grade for how complete their pre-class activities are, right? They have to complete them before class time starts. And then once class time starts, We get together and we're going to apply this information in a practical situation so they can build that conceptual understanding. So in this case, I give them a crime scene. It's a dead body that's found at Provo Canyon. We have this wrecked car. We have evidence. And we might do, and let me point this out, we might do at the very beginning of class, we usually do like a 5 minutes tops discussion of what they should have learned from the pre-class activity. I might put up the learning outcomes and just say, hey, were there any burning questions from the pre-class activity? We'll talk about it for 5 minutes. And then we just jump right in, because doing this activity will let me know and them know if they learned what they were supposed to from the pre-class activity. So we've got this crime scene. Just like the Jack the Ripper, we want them to figure out how are they going to solve this, right? And so we give them STR outputs. So they learned what they were, but they didn't learn how they actually use them. So we're giving them an actual STR profile. We're teaching them how to use it, to compare people, to calculate probabilities. How does it work with parents and Hardy-Weinberg and all of that stuff. And they walk through, but they're working in groups. I'm walking around facilitating, helping them build those concepts. And then at the very end of class, we just put the learning outcomes up again and say, okay, how do we feel? Can we do all of these things now that you've been through this experience? And we might clear up a few misconceptions there. But that's how I do a flipped classroom. Certainly there's lots of ways to do it, but that's just one practical application of this process that I do in my class. And we'll talk about it more when we get together.